Chapter 9. Peter zipped up into the air, latched himself to the wall of the building before he crawled over the ledge of the rooftop. He stopped and straightened before he started to pace. Stupid. 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 Let fate help me find you? What the hell was that? Groaning, he ran his gloved hand over his goggled eyes. He was an idiot. An embarrassment. In truth, he always had issues in controlling his filter, but maybe it was time to really practice holding things back without blurting every thought that crossed his mind. But, as cheesy as it was, at least it got his message across. He wanted to see her again, but it was really out of his hands. It was safer for her that she wasn't seen with Spider-Man. It was bad enough Toombs knew his secret identity. With a heavy sigh, Peter turned back around and stealthily watched as Mary Jane walked out of the alley. True, she was never in any danger in this particular alleyway. He didn't necessarily have to reveal himself to her. But the thought that she would start to make a habit of going down sketchy alleys or streets just because she thought Spider-Man might be around? It scared the living hell out of him. He hoped that she wouldn't continue to do that now that he had sorta intervened. What if something happened while he wasn't around? But, if he were being perfectly honest with himself, he knew that he chose to reveal his presence to Mary Jane because he just wanted to talk to her. It was strange. He had only known her for one night, but he missed her so much. Especially in his bouts of boredom. When Ned couldn't come over to play video games and help him retrieve some of his memories. Even now he found himself missing her when he had only just seen her. An insurmountable amount of tension left him as he saw Mary Jane finally exit the alleyway and step out onto the public street. He would stick around for a while. Follow her for a little bit. He wanted to make sure she got somewhere safe. Did this make him a bit of a stalker? Peter's thoughts rebelled against the idea, telling himself that his intentions were strictly pure. It was only about her safety. Nothing more. But the memory of her pressed against him, shrouded by the darkness of the alleyway, assaulted his mind. Peter pushed it away. He couldn't allow himself the luxury of thinking that way again. Not if this was the last time that he could be potentially seeing her. He followed her for a few blocks before finally noting that the streets were starting to fill with people again. She would be safe the rest of the way to wherever it was she was going. He'd better leave now before the temptation of finding out where she lived would be too much for him. He didn't want to become an actual stalker. With that thought, he bid a silent farewell to the gorgeous Mary Jane, perhaps for forever, before he zipped off into the early night. Peter landed on the windowsill outside of his bedroom and tried to open it as quietly as he could manage. He wasn't sure if Aunt May was home. But he didn't want to test that theory by making it known that he had deliberately defied her by sneaking out to fight as Spider-Man. The old pane of glass creaked as he pushed it up. He winced at the sound. "Peter?" His Aunt May's voice sounded from the living room. He heard her footsteps coming from down the short hall. Panicked, Peter leapt through the window before he crawled into bed, throwing his comforter over his homemade suit and tearing off the mask just before his bedroom door opened. May's head poked through the opening of the door, staring at him, completely expressionless. "Hey, Aunt May," Peter said, trying to act casual as he pulled his comforter up further to his chin. "What's up?" May frowned, her critical eyes taking him in. "Where were you?" Peter tensed for a split second before he let out the breath that he had been holding. The jig was up. He was totally caught red-handed. People were screaming, "Aunt May." I couldn't just ignore it. This gave his aunt some pause. Before she gave a violent shake of her head. The police could have handled it. Trust me, they couldn't have stopped this guy. It was the truth. Peter himself had barely managed to defeat him. It was only when it started to rain when the idea of using the water blast from the fire hydrant came to mind. But there had been way too many close calls there. Enough for Peter to know for a fact that the cops would have been at the mercy of this Sandman instantly. "Then you could have called Tony," May argued, not at all understanding where Peter was coming from on this. "Mr. Stark's in D.C. His Aunt May threw her hands up in the air in exasperation. "Then he could have sent his drones to take care of it. Regardless, you're still recovering. Not to mention you're still grounded, young man." Peter huffed and fell back against his pillow with a sigh. It was true that Mr. Stark could have sent drones to assess and take care of the situation. But what if they hadn't been able to stop it? What would have happened to Mary Jane then? Would she have been kidnapped? Killed? He would have hated himself if anything happened to her. Despite how many jokes he told while fighting that Sandman, he was still scared out of his mind for her the entire time. When he first saw her, standing there with those sandy clutches wrapped tight around her limbs, Peter thought that he was going to pass out just from the shock and panic that he felt squeezing at his chest. That was before the adrenaline kicked in. How could he have just let her safety be left up to a bunch of drones? There was only one answer to that question. He wouldn't have been able to. Uncle Ben's words about power and responsibility flashed through his mind. "How did you even notice that I was gone?" Peter asked when he had no logical answer to give his aunt. How could he possibly say that he didn't trust the most powerful technology in the world to do the job right? May sighed as she let herself lean against the frame of his bedroom door. "Because I ran into Belle while at the store and invited her over for dinner. I came here to tell you, but, of course, you weren't here." Peter ignored the slight irritation Aunt May sent him with that last comment as he looked at her, confused. "Who's Belle?" Face softening, it seemed that May was suddenly reminded that Peter was still recovering from amnesia, and was therefore hazy on many details. "She's our neighbor. The sweet older lady who makes those oatmeal raisin cookies you like so much. Any of this ringing a bell?" Peter shook his head and a wave of vertigo came over him. Suddenly, he was so very tired. This happened a lot when he was trying to remember something that he couldn't quite get a grasp on yet. Frustration mounted within him. He was sure that this Belle woman was perfectly nice and sweet, but Peter would have preferred it if she didn't come over at all. The feelings that he had on the matter must have been displayed on his face because his Aunt May looked at him disapprovingly. "Be nice, Pete. You may not remember, but she really helped out a lot when Ben..." She cut herself off abruptly and her face turned ashen for a moment before she shook her head, trying to shake away the memories. Anyway, she forced herself to continue, turning her face downward to look at her fiddling hands. "She's done a lot for our family, so I want you to be on your best behavior, all right, Pete?" Peter swallowed thickly as he nodded shakily. The few memories that he had regained of Uncle Ben were swarming in his mind. "Peter?" Ben's voice called from the other side of his bedroom door before he turned the knob and invited himself in. Peter didn't even look up from the project he was working on, too focused on the scraps of junk he was trying to turn into his own personal computer that he was learning to build from scratch. Because even at 10, Peter was quite the whiz kid, and his aunt and uncle couldn't afford to buy him one. So, Pete would dumpster dive for parts, and the parts he couldn't find, he would save his allowance for. Uncle Ben stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him, before he sighed and leaned against the mantel. "Don't you think it's too nice of a day to be cooped up inside, Pete?" Peter's brows furrowed as he turned the mini screwdriver in his hand. He didn't answer his uncle, instead choosing to better his focus on what his hands were doing. "Come on," Uncle Ben coaxed, "why don't you and I go to the park? Toss a frisbee back and forth and just get some fresh air?" Peter sighed and finally looked up at his uncle, an annoyed look on his small features. "But that would be a complete waste of time, Uncle Ben." Undeterred by his nephew's sour attitude, Uncle Ben laughed. "Why are you in such a hurry to speed through life, Pete? It's the little moments that you are able to look back at and remember most." Peter rolled his eyes, going back to turning the tiny screw in the half-built computer monitor. Uncle Ben let out a heavy sigh before he slowly shut the door, leaving Peter to work in peace. The memory had struck him when he had remembered it 2 days ago, and left him feeling cold. A shiver went down Peter's spine. "Why yeah, Aunt May. Don't worry about me. I'll be good." Aunt May looked up from her hand at him. Her tense shoulders relaxed as she smiled sadly at him. "What am I saying? Of course, you will." She pushed herself off of the door mantel before she walked over to him and pulled into a tight hug. Peter immediately wrapped his arms around her tiny frame, enjoying feeling of motherly comfort. Yes, May wasn't his mom. They weren't even blood related. But he couldn't help but feel that bond with her. Especially when memories of his actual mother were still quite hazy. "You've always been good, Pete. Even towards those who don't deserve it, sometimes." Peter frowned as he held on tight to his aunt. "Yeah, and there are also times he could be a real jerk to those who don't deserve it." He wished that he could remember if there were any times where he did take his Uncle Ben up on his offer. Because Uncle Ben was right. It was the little moments that Peter longed to remember. The moments where they were all a family without a single care or worry in the world. He couldn't believe how much he used to take it all for granted. How much he missed memories that he couldn't even remember having, How much he missed a man he barely remembered. Peter sighed. He had been too afraid to ask how Uncle Ben died. But he figured that he would remember in time. "So, when is this Bell lady coming for dinner?" Peter found himself saying. Aunt May pulled back from their embrace and sat herself down on the edge of his bed and patted his knee underneath the comforter. "In about an hour. So, get that dinky suit off and hop into the shower. You've got sand in your hair." She laughed as Peter's eyes widened. He chose to ignore the sand comment, as he didn't want to worry her, and instead glared at her mockingly, pretending to be offended. "Hey! I worked really hard in making this suit." Aunt May stood as she laughed harder. "When compared to Tony, I would say that any suit looks stinky, Pete." He had nothing to say to that. When it came to suits, Mr. Stark was the expert. Peter was freshly showered and dressed. He had to shampoo his hair 3 times in order to get all of the sand particles out of his hair. So he had to rush to get ready for when their neighbor, Belle, came over. He hadn't bothered with putting on anything special. He found out quickly that their dinners were always casual here. So, he put on a sweatshirt and jeans that he knew for sure were clean. When he left his room, his aunt was busy bustling around the kitchen, tossing the salad before checking the chicken that was baking in the oven. Peter sniffed at the air and sighed appreciatively. After his fight with that Sandman guy, he suddenly realized how much energy he must have used in defeating him. He was ravenous. "Smells good, Aunt May," a smile was sent in her direction with his compliment. She glanced at him with her own smile as she pulled out the pan of chicken breasts and proceeded to cut into it to check if it was done properly. When a knock resounded from the front door. "Can you get that please, Pete?" May asked as she cut into the next piece of meat. Peter nodded, even though she wasn't looking at him to see, as he made his way to the door. He turned the deadbolt and then the lock on the handle, twisted the metal knob and opened it with a swing of his arm. Peter froze and his jaw dropped at who he saw standing within the frame of the open door. "Face it, Tiger. You just hit the jackpot." I'm evil, I know. Please, if you like this story, then leave a comment. Smile. Reading comments help to motivate me to write faster.